archives. And so I started to learn about Dr. Hynek's, career as a scientist and an educator, and learned that he really, really was very, very accomplished in all of his careers. And sure enough, like I said, there were a lot of things about his astronomy career that reflected on his UFO career and vice versa. For instance, early on in his career, Hynek was hired by the Air Force to do a study on, believe it or not, how stars twinkle. I was really fascinated to find this out, because it didn't make much sense to me. Why would the Air Force want to learn how stars twinkle? Well, it turns out there's a very good reason for it. If you are a fighter pilot up in the sky and you see a light in the sky and you can't tell what it is right away, it could be a star or it could be another aircraft. It could be something hostile in the sky. You better have a pretty good idea. You better be able to identify it pretty quickly. So Hynek's work on how you can tell when a star is twinkling was actually kind of had, a practical benefit for Air Force pilots. But it also came in handy in his UFO research, because he came across so many hundreds, maybe thousands of cases where people were sure they had seen a spaceship, but in reality, it was just the planet Venus, or it was the star Arcturus, and if these people had actually understood how a star twinkles, they would have been able to make a better ID. They would have known that they weren't actually looking at a UFO. So I kept finding those kinds of things where Hynek's two careers sort of crossed over into each other. And that kind of became the basis of the book, the backbone of the book, I guess. That's how I decided to tell the story.
I got to ask you a question, though.
Sure.
Okay, what causes a star to twinkle?
Well, mostly it's atmospheric interference, but there are a lot of weird little wrinkles to this. Now, one of the things he studied was, does a binary star twinkle differently than a regular star? And he found out that, yes, they do. So there's a way to tell from the twinkling which if a star is just a single star or a binary star. He also found out that you can tell the wind speed and direction by the way a star is twinkling, believe it or not.
Oh,
you
wow.
have to be looking, you have to be very observant, I think, to be able to make that determination. But, he was an astronomer. He would spend hours looking through a telescope. So he was used to making those kinds of really long, meticulous observations of things. So this, it just came naturally to him. So those were some of the things he studied and he learned about when he was doing these scintillation studies for the Air Force.
Oh wow, that's so. Go ahead.
That led to interest. So this is I love telling these stories because this is still also fascinating to me. So that early work for the Air Force studying how stars twinkle came back into his career in the late 50s and early 60s, when he developed this program called Stargazer, and again the Air Force financed it. And his idea was that if you could launch a telescope, a high-powered telescope, into a high-altitude balloon that could lift you up above the Earth's atmosphere, you could get rid of that interference and you could get a much clearer image of the stars in the sky. And that experiment, I go into it in great detail in the book. That experiment ultimately was not a success, but if you think about it, it obviously paved the way for the Hubble Space Telescope. Hynek was the first person to dream up the idea of getting a telescope out from under the Earth's atmosphere, out into orbit. Now, in his experiment in these high-altitude balloons, they could only go up about 15 miles. So they weren't completely free of the atmosphere, but they were free enough that it did make a big difference or it would have made a big difference in the image quality had the project succeeded. But I just thought, again, I thought that was such a fascinating aspect of his career, that this crazy idea he dreamed up in the 1950s of getting a telescope up above the Earth's atmosphere literally paved the way for the Hubble Space Telescope and all the other space telescopes that we have in orbit now.
Oh, yeah.
So Hynek was behind all of that.
Well, if he wouldn't have came up with that idea, maybe we wouldn't have those telescopes right now where they're at.
Well, it's possible. And he also came up with another variation on that idea. He did some work in the 1960s helping with the Apollo moon landing programs. he would help determine landing sites for the Apollo missions. And at one point, he pitched an idea to NASA for one of the Apollo missions to take along a telescope to leave on the surface of the moon. So same kind of idea. The telescope would obviously be free of the Earth's atmosphere, and obviously there's no atmosphere on the moon, so this telescope would be able to get much clearer images of stars and planets and celestial bodies, and then beam those images back down to Earth. It could also be used to point at the Earth and, monitor the Earth's atmosphere and weather and things like that. So Hynek was always cooking up these. When he had a good idea, he would keep cooking up various variations of the idea to try to make it work in this way or in that way. Really, really fascinating guy.
That sounds like it. Now, the question is, when you went into that basement, were you shocked about all the, reports he had, all the information he had? Yeah,
I was. I was shocked in two ways. I was shocked, number one, that so much had been preserved, which made me very happy, but also shocked that they weren't really being taken care of properly, and I don't mean that as a criticism at all. It's nobody's fault. There just isn't money for it. These are all records that really should be they should be archived, and they should be preserved, and they should be protected, and they're not right now. There was Mark Rodiger's basement, and there's another one of the CUFOS officers who lives across town who also had a bunch of material, case files in her basement. She also had additional case files up in her attic, which was very difficult to get to. So, the material was fantastic, but the state of the material and the accessibility of the material was kind of a problem. So I was disappointed in that. And like I said, it was just a bunch of beat-up old file cabinets and bookshelves and just a wealth of material there, but just not really preserved the way it should be. And I would hope that at some point there will be resources and money and interest in preserving that material, because it's really wonderful stuff.
Well, that's the problem. Even nowadays, there's a lot of groups. There's like Peter Davenport, that tracks, UFO sightings and stuff. What's going to happen when he passes on? With all the information he's gathered. There's so much of that information out there that basically will be lost. Just like what you're talking about right now. Being kind of stored in a couple different places between the attic and the basement and all that stuff. It's probably was in some form of starting to break down, if I'm willing to bet. But is rich. If without that type of stuff, that is information that should be, where people, that are into it should be able to have access to what it is.
Yeah, and but then there's also this other aspect of it that's, people are also very proprietary about their UFO records. So, and again, I'm not saying this to criticize anyone, because I think it's a perfectly natural thing. But one organization has their own case files, and they guard those very jealously, and another organization has their case files, and they guard those very jealously, and they're not willing to share with each other. So, to me, that kind of hinders UFO research. I think it would be a much better situation if people were more interested in sharing and making information available to others. Doesn't always work out that way. But yeah, I'm trying to think now. The case files in the second basement that I mentioned, I don't know for sure, but I'm willing to bet that collection has, oh my gosh, it's got to be in the thousands, and it's cases going back all the way to the 1940s, all the way up to present day, and it's just file cabinet after file cabinet after file cabinet. You could spend days looking through this stuff, and you'd still want to read more, because it's just so fascinating.
It sounds like he well documented everything.
Yeah, he did. Well, that started out because he got into the UFO business because the Air Force approached him back in the late 1940s about working for them on this new this new UFO study, which to begin with was called Project Sign, S-I-G-N, Project Sign. And this was formed by the Air Force back in the late 40s when the UFO craze was really just beginning. And people would see strange things in the sky. They wouldn't be able to identify them. And they'd want to find out what it was they saw. Well, who do you call? You're going to call the Air Force, because the Air Force is in charge of protecting our skies. So the Air Force was getting all these UFO reports in the late 1940s. They had no idea what to do with them. And finally, a very wise general, Hoyt Vandenberg, said, you know what, this is, no, it wasn't Vandenberg. I think it was General Twining. Yeah, it's been a while since I've done my research, so sometimes my names slip up a little, so you'll have to forgive me. But someone at the Air Force was wise enough to say, you know what, we should set up a special group to study these things, because we don't know what they are, and we really need to know if they pose a threat to our country. So the Air Force puts together Project Sign. They quickly realize that they need a scientist on staff to sort of give them cover for their analyses of these UFO sightings. So Project Sign was housed at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. Hynek at the time was teaching at Ohio State, so he was about 90 miles away from the Air Force Base. So these Air Force guys show up at Hynek's office at Ohio State one day, and they offer him this interesting consulting job. They say, we've got hundreds and hundreds of UFO reports. We would like to hire you to go through these reports and let us know if this person was really looking at a star or a comet or a meteor, so that we can file these away as explained, because the Air Force really wanted to explain all of these cases. So that's how Hynek got into the business. He was recruited by the Air Force, and once or twice a month he'd get a stack of reports from the Air Force, and he'd go through them, and he would read the case report, and he would check his star charts, and the guy had been a professional astronomer now for almost 20 years. He knew his stuff inside and out, and it was very easy for him to read a report and say, oh, well, this person was obviously looking at the planet Venus. Oh, well, this person was obviously looking at a comet. This comet appeared in that part of the sky that night. So Hynek was really, really good at debunking these UFO reports. That's how he got into it. And so, case files started to pile up with the Air Force. So that's one place they came from. But then CUFOS, when CUFOS was founded in the 1970s, they started getting, their own massive influx of UFO reports. So that's where all these file cabinets that I'm talking about, that's where all the paperwork in those file cabinets comes from. It's a lot of old Blue Book stuff, but it's a lot of CUFOS stuff from over the years. So it's literally decades and decades of UFO reports. And the thing is about UFO reports, if you or any of your listeners have ever looked through the Blue Book archives, you have to go through a lot of weak, sometimes useless reports and information before you find anything that's actually really interesting and credible. So that's the other part of it. All these thousands and thousands of case files in all these file drawers, but you have to look through so much stuff before you find a sighting that actually jumps out and is like, oh, this is different. This isn't just a little light in the sky. There's actually something really interesting going on in this case. Those are the ones you want to look for, but you have to really, really look hard and to put a lot of time into it.
Yeah, and one thing, like you mentioned, Project Blue Book. I read one time that the Air Force, when they were investigating it, they tried their best to debunk it as they were investigating. Now, maybe I was wrong, but the articles I was reading about it, but it seemed like they wanted to close out each case really fast.
Yeah, and that explains why they wanted to hire Dr. Hynek, because they knew they could count on him to identify as many cases as possible as very ordinary astronomical or atmospheric phenomenon. Yeah, they desperately wanted to explain the UFO cases away because they didn't want Number one, they didn't want the American public to be worried about this weird phenomenon that was going on.